Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Strange Playgrounds podcast once again. Thank you so much to everyone who listened to myself and Kit Power on the last episode, and thank you to Kit for coming on. It was an absolutely wonderful discussion, it really was. Look forward to more of that. I've been putting feelers out, and there's a couple of people who have agreed to be my guests here in the utter darkness, in the strange and surreal other realm, the beyond the 9 circles of hell state that are indeed the Strange Playgrounds. But for this one, this is a little sort of off the cuff podcast, I suppose. There's so much to talk about. There's always so much to talk about. That's my problem when it comes to not just literature, but anything, video games, cinema, philosophy, art, whatever. There's too much, and there's too much to say about it. There is an infinite variety and spectrum of potential interpretations of media. It's so difficult for me to focus down on one. I'm like a butterfly, I'm like a hummingbird, going from one dark and diseased flower to the next. I cannot tell you how energized I am and how enthused I am by distressing material, by material that many people proclaim not to like, that many people proclaim to find distressing or disturbing. And I've no doubt that is true on some level. But part of me, it's not that it doesn't believe them, it's that it regards them as being slightly deluded, as being cultivated and conditioned by society to deny what they find interesting. The raw fact of the matter is we all find the morbid and the distressing and the disturbing and the extreme interesting. It's why horror exists. It's why various forms of media exist. We find it exhilarating. Even things like Harry Potter, which is ostensibly aimed at children, contains distressing and disturbing material. Newspapers and news reports and soaps and even the most banal media often has these elements, it incorporates these elements. And it's what really stirs us. It's because it's extreme, it's because it's interesting. Death is the big one. Death is the grand taboo. And yet, it's one of our primary drives, Thanatos and Eros. It is one of our primary drives. It is one of the things that obsesses and motivates us. And I think for some of us, it is consciously so. I am not in any way distressed or disturbed by the subject of death. I am not. And that may be because of my own input and constitution. I mean, as I've said before on this podcast, memory is a shaky thing, so this may be a case of my own self-mythologization, I don't know. But I remember being a very morbid child, or what would be called morbid. I remember thinking about death, and indeed the inevitability of my own death, but also mass death, things like genocide, like environmental collapse, like the destruction of this world, or at least of our species, a lot when I was a child, and that may have something to do with my influences and my input. I was born in the 1980s, 1984 specifically, and all of the media around that era was about imminent apocalypses. Almost all of it. I was born into a generation that has had nothing thrown at them other than the threat of collapse, of economic catastrophe, of environmental disintegration, of wars, of nuclear apocalypse, of pandemics. This is what the media in all of its forms is throwing at us. So it's hardly surprising, really, is it, that you have an entire generation, more or less, that's grown up obsessed with death, with various conditions like social anxiety and depression, and with a lack of engagement and interest with culture and society at large. And that's a very complex thing. It's a very complex situation. I suffer that immensely. I find culture at large very difficult to engage with because I find it banal. I find it pointless, I find it contrived, I find it banal for the most part. I find it navel-gazing. What I want to do, in reality, when I see someone in the street, what I want to do is grab them by the shoulders and shake them and scream in their faces that they're just going through the motions, they're just waiting to die. That's pretty much it. They're just putting things in the way of death. and not referencing it. They're not acknowledging it. They're just sort of like going through their lives as it's been dictated to them, like cattle being driven, like water running through prescribed channels. And I find that difficult to cope with. I find that very difficult to cope with, and that makes engaging with society very hard. And that has been a problem. That has been a problem of mine for a long, long time. But it also means that death was always there. Death has always been there. I remember at the ages of like 8 thinking about death. I have a very vivid, means it's probably false, but or at least contrived or exaggerated to some degree. But bear with me for the sake of this conversation. I have a very vivid memory of sitting in the play park, which is opposite where my parents live, with no one else around on a very dark and wet and windy day, sitting on the swings and just watching the world go by on my own, just watching the world go by as a child. I think I may have been 8 years old at the time, and just feeling this overwhelming pointlessness to everything, thinking to myself about the utter inevitability of the grave and of how it is ineluctable and makes everything around it contrived and ridiculous. It makes life absurd. It makes life this absurdist theatre, which you don't really have to engage with if you don't want to. And that has followed me through my life. That has actually been a consistent... It's not just a problem, it's not just a neurosis, and it's not just a motivation either. It is both of those things and none of them. It's a fundamental part of who I am. I often say to my friends when we get into these deep conversations, like, everything at this point is a bonus for me, because I never expected to live this long. And they often find that very difficult to take, but that is the truth. That is the truth. This is depression talking, by the way. This is depression and social anxiety talking. This is what it sounds like to be depressed, I suppose. I'm not depressed now at all. I'm really not. Certainly nothing compared to how I was as a child or a teenager or during my 20s. Certainly not. But this is the voice of depression. This is the language of depression. I still find it amazing that I am alive at 34. That's at least a decade beyond what I expected to live. It's about a decade beyond how I expected humanity to survive, quite frankly. And as I say, that is likely as a result of my input. That is likely as a result of what the media was constantly hammering into me, whether it was fiction, whether it was news media, whatever. It's insidious in many respects, but it has also fostered, it meant going through the darkness, it meant going through the disease, it meant going through things like depression, suicidalism, anxiety. 2 attempts, by the way, neither successful, thankfully. Mercifully, fucking hell, mercifully not successful. So death has always been a subject that's fascinated me. I've always been fascinated by the imagery of death. Things like the Sedlec ossuary in Kutna Hora, which is an Orthodox Christian shrine in Kutna Hora, which is a small town outside of Prague, and the Sedlec ossuary is made of bones, or rather the interior is decorated with the bones of the priests that have presided there and the faithful that attended there, and the bones have been worked into these absolutely exquisite formations and icons and whatnot. It is stunning. It is a genuinely spiritual place to me, whether you are Christian or not, and I'm not, by the way. I'm not specifically religious at all. In fact, I find the notion of religion to be quite anathema. I find it to be antithetical to what I consider to be genuine operation. I won't even use the term spirituality because I hate that term. It's become so diseased and so polluted, and it means so little. But genuine metaphysical operation, if you like. Religion, by its very nature, is antithetical to that, insofar as I'm concerned. But the Sedlec ossuary is the kind of place where if I want to visit it before I die, and I imagine that I'm going to have a moment there, as I have in many places throughout the world, as I have in many places. Beauty, architectural, geographical, environmental, always moves me to tears. It's always something very profound for me, and it's often in places like forests or on mountains or hillsides or whatever, or even things like industrial estates. I find old abandoned industrial estates very moving in their own peculiar way. Wasteland, in the UK we have these it's like patches of wasteland that nobody particularly owns, that can't be done, nothing can be done with them, no land can be developed there, and they're just in the middle of like suburban environments or even urban environments, and they're overgrown and they're like fenced off. I love that. I love that. I find that very moving in a very bizarre way. I find them artistic and beautiful, and places that I want to operate. There is a spirituality innate to their dirt, in their decay, that I really love. I really love. They are secret places. They are profane and profound at the same time, and I love that. I can't help but imagine that there's something in there, that there's something like the echoes or the ghosts of what used to be there, or maybe even it's where the entities of old mythologies and folklore now sustain. It's where they echo. I love that notion. I think it's beautiful. I think it's absolutely beautiful. But the Sedlec ossuary is somewhere where I want to go, because I imagine I'll have an epiphanic moment there. I can have epiphanic moments just looking at photographs of it. It is beautiful. It is absolutely stunningly, gorgeously beautiful, and it's the morbidity. It's the being surrounded by death, but death that's been turned into something erotic, turned into something that's actually beautiful and inspiring. That commingling of of Thanatos and Eros I find to be irresistible. I think it's absolutely stunning. I think it's beautiful, where you have the commingling of the morbid and the energizing. I find that irresistible. It's something that horror does beautifully, but death is something that I don't find difficult. Death itself as a notion is not something I find difficult. Pain, yeah. Disgrace, indignity is more important to me. The indignity that often comes before death is way more frightening to me than the fact of death. Way more frightening. Life, insofar as I'm concerned, is a total incidence. It's a total incidence. More than half of the human beings who were ever conceived died during childbirth. So the notion life is a complete biological incidence. It's a complete nonsense. There's nothing sacred about life at all. But dignity and quality of life, yeah, they are profound. They are profound. And being deprived of that, there are standards of living I'm prepared to accept. There are standards of dignity I'm prepared to accept. And when they end, then so do I. And that is the end of it, either by my own hand or by others. And I've made that very, very plain indeed. So death has always been there. It's always been a constant companion. The not just the notion of death, but the inevitability of it. It's something that is never far away from my thoughts, never terribly far away, and it is something that informs me, that is part of me. And in later years, it has become very beautiful to me. It is not a matter of something that deprives my life or something that impinges upon my life. It's something that lends my life impetus and intrigue and internal poetry. It's something that I absolutely love. The imagery of death. The notion is very romantic. I find the notion of death itself quite romantic in its own peculiar way, because it is extreme. It is one of arguably three of the most extreme things you'll ever experience, being born, which none of us remember consciously, but whose trauma echoes down our life and informs practically everything we think or feel or do. The original trauma, of which we are all victims, and falling in love, which not all of us experience, but yes, I've had that, and that is profound. That is something that when it does come, I think for a lot of people is a big shock. And I don't mean just like having a relationship. We all have relationships all the fucking time. And I don't just mean having sex, although that is beautiful too. It's actual romantic love, where you realise that all of that hideous doo-wah-wah poetry and love songs, it's actually true. It does make you feel like that. It does make you feel like every day is a new dawn. It does make you feel like singing with Mr. Bluebird and all of that bollocks. It's looking at it now, it's actually quite hideous. But yes, there's that, and there's death. Death, the experience of death is one that we're all going to have, barring certain advancements in technology. And it is one of the extremities that binds us all. It's one of the most extreme things we'll ever experience. It is the extremis, in fact. And it's something that fascinates me. It's something I wish I could emulate, actually. It makes me wish there were technology that would allow us, like a sort of simulation technology, that would allow us to experience death synthetically or virtually, because I want to know what it would do to us as a living mind, as a consciousness. Can you cope with that? Can you cope with feeling yourself die and come out of it entirely sane? Can you come out? Well, you won't come out of it as the same person. That's definitely the case. In the same way, you don't come out of love as the same person. You don't even come out of like having sex as the same person. It makes you something different. You don't come out of suicide or depression as the same person. It makes you something different. But death is something that does not concern me in and of itself, but fascinates me. It doesn't frighten me, it fascinates me. For its potential, for its that moment, that point when you know consciousness is slipping away and you know it's the end, the end. That the very notion sends prickles up my spine. It makes me feel very energized. It makes me feel kind of morbidly erotic, if that makes any particular sense. But it's something that I find interesting because it's something that a lot of people deny. It's something that a lot of people will do anything not to think about or not to talk about, despite the fact it is one of these subjects. Sex and death are the things we love to talk about. And most of the time, when we're talking about other things, we're actually talking about those things in unconsciously or subconsciously euphemistic terms very, very often. Death is not something we should shy away from. Pain isn't something we should shy away from. It's something we all have. Trauma is something we shouldn't shy away from. These are all things we experience. Every single one of us is a composite of our traumas. Every single one of us. And we all share that original trauma in common. No matter how it occurs, I mean, every birth is its own peculiar thing. But we share the trauma. And it is something we need to acknowledge. It binds us. It unites us. We are bound in the blood of our essential traumas, if you like. We are bound in the blood of our essential traumas, and it defines us in ways that we don't acknowledge enough, but that we express in much more neurotic ways. And this is what the fiction and the media that I like allow me to explore and express. It's the media that I create that does it. I mean, I have coming out very soon Born in Blood, not the visual volumes that my photographer friend Nick is working on, but the short story collections, and they are about this. They are about this essential trauma, and they're about making a metaphysics out of it. And the fiction and the art and the media that I favour does that. It does it beautifully. I was reminded of it very recently, both death and the fact of that traumatic element of media, with the death of Harlan Ellison. Now, Harlan Ellison is not as well known here in the UK as he is in the US. Most people don't really know who he is in the UK, although they have experienced his media, they just don't know it. Harlan is and was one of the iconic science fiction writers, and in fact it's very difficult to bound his fiction, as it is with all the very best writers and authors. Elements of it are science fiction, elements of it are horror, elements of it are fantasy, elements of it are sort of psychological and political and socio-cultural. But what I love about Harlan's fiction, and I came to it very late, I didn't know who he was, but I came to it through the video game adaptation of I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, which is based on one of Harlan's most iconic short stories. And Harlan Ellison is actually in the video game. He plays Am, and he is the narrator of the piece. It is one of the most morbid, macabre, and I won't say nihilistic, because I don't think it is. A lot of people call it nihilistic. I would say it's misanthropic. It's more misanthropic than nihilistic. Misanthropic in the sense that it has no love for humanity. It has no particular love for humanity. And in fact takes glee in its torment and mutilation of humanity. But it is not nihilistic. It is not nihilistic in the sense that humanity, despite having come to its extremist, to its ultimate point, to its very end, having been the author of its own hell, there are individual humans that end up taking control, that end up taking power from the god that is the synthetic god Am, which is the reflection of all of humanity's collective neuroses made manifest and conscious. It is our masochism and sadism, it is our narcissism, it's everything made manifest in this uber god computer that has control over reality at a molecular level, and spends most of its time elaborately and monstrously tormenting the 5 human beings that it's decided to spare from annihilation. But they take agency back from it in the end, and they do it through supreme acts of self-sacrifice, which will bring worse than death upon them, that will bring unimaginable indignity and agony. And that is something beautiful. There is something macabrely beautiful and humanist in that. And that's what you find in Harlan Ellison's fiction all the way through. There are nihilistic elements to some of his fiction, definitely. He doesn't have a great love for humanity. He doesn't have any hope for humanity. He doesn't have any hope for human society or culture. But he has an almost artistic appreciation for individual human beings and for the small acts of self-sacrifice that cast a revealing light upon the mass evils, upon the great neuroses. And that's what you get from Harlan Ellison's fiction. It is absolutely wonderful. It's dark, it is macabre, it's morbid, it's sensationally written. Sensationally written, very old-fashioned in its own peculiar way, in the sense that it is not specific. His fiction is almost poetic in the way it's written. A lot of the stuff that he writes alludes to rather than states, and I love that. I absolutely love that in any writer. And the fact that he does so beautifully and so poetically, and with reference to these very, very dark and big and resonant ideas, makes me very, very happy indeed. I adore the man's work, and it reminded me, it still reminds me now, it reminds me of these essential elements of myself, of the fact that death and morbidity and despair are very much a part of who I am, but are not the totality, or rather, they are not depressing elements anymore. They are not elements that undermine me in any particular way. They're elements that motivate me and make me want to express and make me want to almost dance amongst the ashes. There's almost like a Joker-esque element, like the Batman's Joker, the anarchist element that wouldn't necessarily mind seeing things collapse around it, that finds a kind of beauty and frisson in decay and collapse and disintegration. There is something very, very pretty about that, and also very inspiring, something innately human, I find, because it's something that crops up in our fiction all the fucking time. Dystopian fiction is huge, absolutely huge, and the reasons for that are very complex. It is not because of any one simple factor, any more than anything in fiction or media, or indeed in our own psychologies, is due to any one simple factor. If you ever come up in a conversation or a debate or an argument where someone is trying to state that such and such a thing is because of this and that's it, because it's this simple, they're trying to refine it down to simple terms or simple factors, as often happens in popular discourse, unfortunately, certainly political discourse and cultural discourse. Forget it. There's no point in engaging with that conversation, because there are not simple reasons for anything. There are not simple reasons for racism. There are not simple reasons for narcissism. There are not simple reasons for why the poor vote for conservative powers that will always undermine them. There is no simple answer for why people who are on the left, who are technically anarchist but still feel as though they need to be part of the overall engine, still insist that the systems work and that there is some hope in them. There's no simple reason behind these things. They are complex. They are very, very complex. We are very complex. The most simplistic human being on earth is infinitely, powerfully, profoundly, and I would argue inextricably complex. You cannot unpick them because they are so ridiculously ambiguous and conflicted and contradictory and wonderfully, wonderfully, wonderfully complex. It is not a simple matter. None of us are, and nothing is. Certainly nothing about the abstract structures that we create. But no, I don't find it's something you come up against time and again, especially if you don't come off as being like overtly morbid. If you're not a cartoon character, essentially, if you don't go around with very long jet black hair, wearing long black funeral garb, and talking about smoking cheroot cigarettes and talking about what a drag existence is. People don't believe you. They don't believe you when you talk to them about the stuff that interests you, the stuff that is macabre, that is dark, that is generally considered to be deviant, and the remit of serial killers and sadists and whatnot. I don't find it macabre or surprising at all. I actually have a very, I never used to while I was in the midst of my depression, but I have a very chipper disposition these days. I like to talk, I like to engage with people, and I like to engage with them on a deep level. I like to talk about things, as I hope comes through on these podcasts. So, I hope they're not morbid, I hope they're not macabre. But I like to talk to them about real things, and the real things, the stuff that's worthy of discussion, is often deep, dark rakings of the subconscious. We want to talk about what motivates us. We want to talk about the inevitabilities of life that we cannot with most other people in our lives, even the people we love the most, our spouses, our parents, our children, our relatives. We cannot talk to them about these things very often. We are afraid. We are afraid of driving them away. We are afraid of embarrassing ourselves. We are afraid of them judging us. And I find that bizarre because these are the most interesting conversations to me. It's why the fiction and the art and the media that does explore them has this consistent allure. It's why people like me exist, who create this stuff, not just consume it, but create it, who want to express it, who want to explore new facets of it, and I do. I really do. I feel there's so much to be talked about. The beauty of horror, the beauty of the disturbing, the beauty of death. It does exist. It is there. And it pervades our mythologies. It pervades our architecture. It pervades almost every element of our societies. But we don't acknowledge it. We don't acknowledge it. We'd rather the superfice. We'd rather the aesthetic, the plastic. We'd rather the stuff that makes us feel comfortable, and that is a problem for me. As I talked about on the last podcast, it is a problem for me. Personally, I don't want consoling. I don't want consoling. I'm not consoled by... Although, that said, there is a contradiction even here. Even this is problematic for me, personally. Even this is problematic. I am somewhat consoled by the notion of death. I am somewhat consoled by it because no matter what else happens, that is inevitable. That is inevitable. That oblivion is inevitable. And there is something very comforting about that. The death is very, very attractive in that regard. In fact, that is very much what drove my 2 suicide attempts. It was because I wanted to be away. It's because consciousness became a burden. It's because I was tired of waking up. I was tired of talking to myself in my own head and of the endless chatter and contradiction and the powerlessness and all of that stuff. That's what drove it. It was a desire for peace, a need to be out of my own skull. And the only way of doing it was by cracking that skull open, was by ending it completely. And I don't necessarily have any problem with that at this point. I don't necessarily have an issue with it. I think it's a terrible thing. I think it's I think it's sad when people feel, when they come to the extremes where they cannot cope anymore, where being human, where being alive is too much to bear. I have absolute sympathy. I am not, because I can't not. I've been there. I cannot be one of those people who regards it as in any way cowardly or as selfish. It's just not. It is just one of those things where life is hell, where existing is hell. But the thing is, in that regard, those of us who know what suicide is and who have courted death before, we're just ahead of the curve. To borrow a quote from the Joker once again, we're just ahead of the curve. That is going to happen to all of us eventually if we live long enough. And, I work in care, and I know I don't work with the elderly myself. I don't work with Alzheimer's or dementia. I work with autism and Down syndrome and that kind of thing. But I know people who do. And one of the most consistent things that comes up is there are people in their care who just don't want to live anymore. They've had enough. They find life itself to be an indignity. And they want to die. And that is, to me, a right that they deserve. If they're lucid. I'm so sorry about that, ladies and gents. I just had a moment where all of my wiring came out and I wasn't recording a fucking thing. Shit, tits and arse. Let me catch up. It's a dignity that they deserve, I do believe, for me personally. It's a dignity that they deserve. The only reason that they are being kept alive is for us. It's for our comfort. It's because we are conflicted about death and because we find it problematic and because we find it uncomfortable. That's the only reason. It's selfish. It's absolutely a selfish thing on our part, on the part of people who promote life as though it's the be-all and end-all. No, as I said earlier, dignity is the big thing. Dignity and quality of life is what matters. And as I imagine those of us who have at least some understanding of what death is, who've been there, I imagine we have maybe a better idea than most what a comfort it can potentially be. I think it can be comfortable. I think it can be beautiful. I think it can be something to be desired, and that's a very uncomfortable thing because it's against every natural urge in our biology. It's against everything in our morality. It's against everything in our culture. Everything promotes life for life's sake, and that to me is, as I believe, who was it who said that is the ideology of the cancer? Who was it who said that? Because it is true. That is the ideology of the cancer. Life for life's sake, just endless continuation, with no purpose, no real reason, no end game. It's meaningless. It's absolutely meaningless. It's lacking in all poetry. It's lacking in all dignity. And so much of horror fiction, so much of disturbing and distressing media is about that. It's about expressing that, even when it doesn't explicitly express it. And I find that fascinating. For me, that's when horror fiction and horror media is at its best. It's when most fiction and media is at its best. It's when it rakes open the subconscious and it lets us look at things that we wouldn't otherwise want to look at, or we can't look at. It gives us that metaphorical or virtual playground, if you like, where we can explore and express these things without too much in the way of consequence, and in a roundabout way, because that's also how we learn. That's that. If you've ever studied the nature of human learning, the psychology of human learning, almost every study ever done unambiguously demonstrates that we don't learn directly. If we're told something explicitly, we don't take it in. We just don't. However, if we come at something in a roundabout way, say through metaphor or through play or through a story, then we get it. Then we understand on a very innate level. And the reason being, we engage with it then. We engage with it in a way that we don't when we're just told or when we're just shown or whatever. We engage with it and we make it part of who we are, part of what we are, how we operate, and it becomes play. It becomes part of our own innate mythologies and our narratives of self, if you like, our folkloric selves. And this is why it's so important for fiction to deal with this stuff, to deal with these matters, for art in general to deal with these matters, the things that make us uncomfortable. It's why living now is actually rather problematic, because there are so many prominent socio-cultural and political forces that don't want us to. That don't want us to look at this stuff, that don't want us to express this stuff for one reason or another, whether it's the narcissistic censorship and the misplaced morality of those on the far left, or whether it's the open oppression and tyranny and despotism of those on the right. You know? Either way, there are real concerns for those of us who love the deviant, the transgressive, and who want to create it, who want you to be triggered, who like being triggered ourselves, who like to be disturbed and upset and unsettled by what we consume. It's important. It's really, really important for us to have that. And to learn to cope with it, and to be able to express it when we create it ourselves, and not to have to worry constantly about not causing offence. I don't give two shits about that, quite frankly. I've never given two shits about that. I don't think anyone who produces any kind of art should give two shits about that. Whatever you create, if you create it and you feel it and you think it, it should be unambiguous. It should be totally unambiguous. But of drawing these censorious powers down upon ourselves, and they can bury us. They have buried us. They've buried people before. It's a real problem, and it speaks to something really quite distressing in humanity, which is that we want to control how other people think and feel. We want to control how people consume media and how they interpret media. It's not your business. If you don't get anything out of something, or you find something, if you find something distressing or upsetting or absurd, or you don't want it, then don't consume it. That's the rub. Don't consume it. Turn off the television. Turn off the YouTube video. Don't read the book. Don't read the poem. Go and do something else. And that does not include writing letters of outrage or whatever. Go and do something else, but do not stop other people from reading it or consuming it. I mean, there are books out there I positively loathe. I think they are totally corrosive. I think they're foul. But I would never, ever, ever, ever stop anyone reading them. In fact, I would advise you to go out and read them. Go and read them. Go and read them. Things like the works of Ayn Rand, for example. Now, Ayn Rand is one of those writers who I absolutely despise. I absolutely despise. I think her philosophy, so-called philosophies, are paper thin. I think they are vast structures of narcissistic self-justification and justification for born privilege, not for hard work but for privilege. And what she promotes as just and wonderful is a fairy tale. I think it's a fairy tale. It doesn't actually exist. But I would advise you to go and read all of her work. All of it. It's poorly written, it's absurd, it's ridiculous, but you need to determine that yourself. Do not take my word for that. Go and read it and make up your own minds. You might get something out of it. You might get something different out of it that I didn't. Maybe my interpretation is flawed. I would advise you to go and read all of that stuff. I would advise you to go and read all of the religious texts that make you uncomfortable. I've read the Bible in many various forms. I've read the Quran and I love mythologies and religious texts in general. I love them all, even when I find them hateful and when I find them unpleasant, and there's plenty in both of them, in all of them in fact, that one might find hateful and unpleasant. But you can't know that unless you read them for yourselves. And there is a real problem that relates to almost everything else we've been talking about here in postmodern culture, where people don't want to do that. They don't want to do the legwork. They don't want to go and read the stuff. They just want to hear about it secondhand. They want to get their opinions secondhand. They want to listen to someone like me on YouTube giving them their opinions rather than actually going and experiencing it for themselves. No, go and read this stuff. If you've never read the Bible, go and read it. If you've never read the Quran, go and read it. If you've never read the Dead Sea Scrolls, if you've never read interpretations of Gilgamesh, if you've never read all of the hateful shit, if you've never read Mein Kampf, go and read it. Go and read it. It gives you insight into how these people operate. It gives you insight into these cultural and political movements, into the psychology of people that you might despise. It's the same reason, and it relates back to what I was talking about earlier about morbidity and about the fascination with what is culturally determined as morbid. Serial killers. I find serial killers fascinating. I find them absolutely fascinating. I find sadists fascinating. I find extreme personalities fascinating. Partly because it is, again, the seat of that fascination is contradiction. On the one hand, what they do and the way they operate is so extreme I can't get a handle on it. I cannot get a handle on how a human being, like, say, for example, Jeffrey Dahmer, who was a very extreme serial killer of young gay men and who did very horrendous and extreme and bizarre things to them while they were both alive and dead. I don't get the process, how one goes from this state to this state, and how that incredibly extreme behavior develops and manifests and sustains itself. It's totally alien to me. On the other hand, there is something very human about serial killers, because we've all thought about killing people at one time or another. We've all almost been driven to it. We've thought about it, every single one of us. Most of us think about it daily. We think about it with ridiculous things, when someone is discourteous to us, when someone cuts us up in a traffic line or something. We think about it on a daily basis, but we ignore it. We don't do anything about it. I find them fascinating. It seems to be an odd thing to say, but I don't follow serial killers, but I read about them. I read about them because I find them interesting. They're extreme personalities that do extreme things outside of all the bounds and regulations of culture and society, and indeed even of humanity. But it's only by exploring them that we can possibly even hope to understand, and indeed recognize them for what they are. It's not morbid, it is not macabre, it is not a promotion of these states to explore them and be interested in them. Not at all. It's simply being interested in extremes of states of mind and behavior. That's all. It's a wonderful and fascinating thing in many respects. No, wonderful is the wrong thing to say, but it's so extreme that it is uniquely fascinating. And I think most people are fascinated by them, whether they admit it or not. I think most people are. It's why we seek them out, and even why we lionize them in fiction. One of my favorite television shows ever created is Hannibal, based on the Thomas Harris books, which I think supersedes any one of the books, and indeed any of the movies made of them. Hannibal is fascinating, and it stands as an example of how we not only are fascinated by these extremes of personality, but how we exalt them sometimes, how we mythologize them. It's a very dark and dangerous thing. Because Hannibal is very sexy. He's very sexy in that series. He is very fucking sexy. Part of that is due to Mads Mikkelsen. It's because of how he's framed and how he's dressed and how he's so beautiful and elegant, that man. But part of it is because of what he is. And that's a very dark and dangerous thing. But it's something that we need to admit if we're going to explore. There is something attractive about the state in which he operates, because it's totally beyond any bounds. It's beyond all of the restrictions under which we operate as morally normal, as psychologically normal human beings, if there is indeed such a thing, if such a thing isn't a contradiction in terms. He operates outside of all bounds of them, that character, and that makes him very, 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 very attractive indeed. Very attractive indeed, in ways that are very dark and difficult to explore. It makes him sexy. He is sexy. There's no two ways about it. As are a lot of serial killers, in fiction, anyway. In fiction. Definitely not in real life. They do not tend to be a sexual bunch. Rather, they don't tend to be a sexy bunch in real life. Although sex is a big part of why they do what they do very often. It's a fascinating thing. It's an absolutely fascinating thing. And to deny it, I think, to deny these parts of ourselves, to deny these fascinations and these interests, that's when you start to get neurosis. That's when you start to get denialism. That's when you start to get problems. That's when you start to get people who are not in touch with their own darkness, if you like. People who are not in touch with the inclinations and indeed maybe even the appetites and the obsessions that they might not want to admit to. And that's when they start to express themselves in very dark ways, in very lurid and very dangerous ways. I'd argue that's where you get your serial killers and your child abusers and your rapists and whatnot. It's when these things are not acknowledged. It's when these things are just allowed to fester inside someone's own skull. That's when you get problems. I mean, for my part, it's a fascinating thing, isn't it? I mean, I am a pacifist in almost every respect. Not in the sense that I wouldn't defend myself if I were attacked or something, or to defend someone else. Yes, then I would use violence. But generally speaking, I'm a pacifist, despite my obsession with media that is violent, that is extreme, that is often very sadistic or sadomasochistic. I am a pacifist, as is my brother, who was also raised on this material. I've never been in a violent altercation. I hope I never really am, to be perfectly honest. I don't want to be in a violent altercation. I've never wanted to be in one. But it's fascinating, isn't it? And I find that is often true. That is often true of people who do enjoy this media, and indeed of who create this media. I mean, if you start, as I have started to do, to operate in, say, the independent horror communities, the communities for independent horror art and fiction and media, you will find that they're largely pussycats. They are largely sweethearts. Not universally, but generally speaking, they're absolute sweethearts. They are nice people. They're decent people. They're good people. They're family people. They're people who love their cats and their dogs and who just get on with life. They are not serial killers in waiting for the most part. They're just people who are in touch with what they know they like. They are in touch with stuff that stirs them and that motivates them and interests them, and which is often morbid. It's often stuff that speaks to their subconscious, to the stuff that most human beings do not want to look at, because that is where everything that makes us feel pain resides. It's everything that makes us feel shame and guilt and inferiority, all the stuff like the little cruelties and sadisms of our childhood, the disappointments in ourselves, the things that we regret doing. It's all there. It's all there. It's swelling and festering as our own neuroses and our subconscious monsters. It's all there waiting to be explored and waiting to be born. It's when you deny it. It's when you deny it's there. That's when it swells even bigger. The monsters grow fat on denialism. They grow fat on it, and they saturate you in very insidious ways. Then they influence you in very insidious ways. When you look at it, when you can happily open that door to your own subconscious and look into it and just see the monsters where they are, and look and see what created them, where they were born, it's not much of a problem. You can express it, you can explore it in other ways, and you can confront it. You can confront it, as very good disturbing media often allows you to do. You can confront these monsters in metaphorical form, and you can not necessarily... I'm not interested in defeating or slaying them. I'm more interested in the ones where the monsters are going to fuck you rather than, make love to you rather than to devour you, or both at the same time, or one after the other. That is more interesting to me, where we accept these things as parts of who we are, as influences upon what we are. That's what fascinates me, and it's something I look for. I don't like superficial horror fiction where it is just about making you go ugh, or making you go oh. I'm not interested in that. I'm not interested in it at all. I am interested in the stuff that resonates, that makes me feel uncomfortable because it's making me think and feel and acknowledge things that I may not want to think or feel or acknowledge, but which is good for me. It's good for me as a psychological being. It's good for me as a conscious entity riding this sack of decaying meat. It's good for me as a soul that is somewhat in love with death, and has not perhaps as much affection for life as he should. It's good for me as someone who doesn't necessarily have much love for humanity, who loves individual human beings and what they create, but doesn't necessarily have much love for humanity or hope for humanity for that matter, as someone who really does court the darkness in all things, in all ways, and is maybe too much in love with it, as I hope a lot of you out there are, as I trust you probably are. But yes, I don't even know what I began with on this. As is often the case with these podcasts, ladies and gents, it's often the case. But I hope you got something out of this. I think I got something out of it. I don't know what it was. I have no idea, as I often don't with these podcasts. But next time, maybe we'll have a guest. Maybe we won't. I don't know. It depends on how things shake out, doesn't it, ladies and gents? But until then, thank you so much once again for listening. If you have any requests, something you'd like me to talk about, please let me know in the comments. And I will endeavour to see what I can do. Until then, cheery bye, ladies and gents.